What I want to do with you today is to share some ideas, some speculative ideas about the future evolution of human sexuality. And my starting point is that, as we all know, in Western societies, although certainly not in many non-Western societies, there is ever greater acceptance of LGBT rights and sexuality. We've gone to a much better place in terms of understanding the human rights and dignity of LGBT people. And so what I want to ask is, if this trend continues towards ever greater acceptance of LGBT people, what will it mean for the future? Where will this lead us in the end? Because we know that human culture evolves and that human sexuality is part of culture, and therefore it too is evolving and will evolve in the future. My starting point, I guess, is that if we move towards a more post-homophobic society where human sexuality is no longer an issue, how will that transition to equality, dignity, and respect? How will that affect the expression of human sexuality? If we move to a sexually enlightened society where there is acceptance of diversity, what would this mean for the future expression of same-sex identity and sexuality? Now, we already know, thanks to a host of different sex surveys, that bisexuality is a fact of life, and that a significant and growing proportion of the population are open to both opposite sex and same-sex attraction. If that is the case, then where will this lead us? If we go back in time in history, we know that Dr. Alfred Kinsey in the United States in the 1940s, he was the first person to give major statistical evidence that the categories of gay and straight are not watertight and mutually exclusive. He discovered that for many people, sexuality is a continuum between people who are 100% heterosexual and those who are 100% homosexual. A lot of people, he found, are to varying degrees somewhere in the middle, a mixture, an amalgam of different sexual desires and attractions. Now, these, of course, may or may not be acted upon, but in his respondents, he found high levels of both opposite sex and same-sex attraction in significant proportions of the many thousands of men and women that he interviewed. An observer poll here in Britain just 3 or 4 years ago found this greater trend towards sexual experimentation as homophobic attitudes decline. It found that of 16 to 24-year-olds, 23% had had a same-sex experience, much higher than the national average and much, much higher than in years and decades past. And so that would indicate to me that already a lot of young people, a significant portion of young people, are recognizing their capacity for both hetero and homo desire. This was something that's also been documented by anthropologists. I'm a great fan of Cleland Ford and Frank Beach, who wrote a book called Patterns of Sexual Behavior, published in Britain in the 1960s. It was the result of a surveys of tribal societies, pre-capitalist societies, mostly in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of the Middle East. And they found that of those 76 societies that they researched or took research from, they found that homosexuality was considered normal and acceptable in 49. That's nearly 2/3 of those societies surveyed from the 1920s to the 1950s. They also recorded that in some Aboriginal cultures, such as the Koriki and Sambia in Papua New Guinea, all young men entered into a same-sex relationship with an older unmarried warrior as part of their rites of passage into manhood. The older warrior taught them the skills of hunting and other manly activities, and that was allied with a sexual relationship. But once completed, those young men ceased to have homosexual contact and went on to marry. In other words, they went through a phase or a period of homosexuality where they were sexually functional with another male, but then resumed what we might call the traditional heterosexual marriage path for the rest of their lives. And Colin Ford and Frank Beach and others have concluded this would indicate that human sexuality is much more malleable than many of us acknowledge, that there's a cultural element in terms of expectations and mores that influences the expression of human sexuality. They said that if sexual orientation was pre-programmed at birth, if it was biologically fixed, it would not be possible for people to be bisexual, or in the case of the Papua New Guinean tribes, to switch from one sexual attraction to another with such apparent ease. So Colin Ford and Frank Beach concluded that heterosexuality, bisexuality, and homosexuality are fundamental to the human species. They are part of the natural spectrum of human sexual desire and attraction, and that they're very substantially influenced by cultural mores and expectations. So this leads me to conclude that if culture changes in our society, surely manifestations of sexuality will also change over time. The crossover between hetero and homo, I think, will become more commonplace. And of course, we are talking about conscious desires. As we know from psychology, many people have hidden unconscious desires that they don't acknowledge or accept. So maybe if we reached a state where it didn't matter who was gay or straight, that sexual orientation was no longer an issue, maybe those people could bring those feelings to the surface that they've hidden and repressed. So this is a picture of human sexuality, which is much more complex, diverse, blurred, and so on, than the traditional simplistic binary image of hetero and homo, which of course is not only loved by many straight moralists, but even held to by many lesbians and gay men. My view is that if sexual orientation has at least an element, perhaps not an entire determination, but an element of indeterminacy and flexibility based on culture, then surely the present forms of heterosexuality and homosexuality are conditional, that they are not likely to remain the same in perpetuity, and that as culture changes, so will expressions of sexuality. In a future non-homophobic society, as the taboos around same-sex relations recede, I suspect, as the Observer poll indicated, that many more people are likely to have gay sex and relationships, even if perhaps only temporarily or experimentally. Interestingly, of course, the demise of homophobia is likely to make redundant the need to assert and affirm one's LGBT identity. In my view and my experience and my study of history, gay and lesbian identities are largely the product of homophobic prejudice and repression. They are a self-defense mechanism against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So, faced with the persecution that they've suffered, we have suffered, because of same-sex relations, the right to defend those relations had to be defended. Hence the emergence of a gay identity and the gay rights movement. But if in the future, if one sexuality is not privileged over another, if defining oneself so particularly is no longer necessary, then surely the need to assert that right or that freedom or that identity will decline. If no one cares who loves who or who has sex with who, the need for an LGBT identity, I think, will over time decline. It won't have the social relevance and significance that it has today, and nor will the need to affirm one's heterosexuality. That too will become redundant over time. The need to assert those boundaries, those differences, will demise with the demise of straight supremacism. As we evolve to a more sexually enlightened and accepting society, homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think, will begin to fade as separate, exclusive orientations and identities. The vast majority of people, I do believe, will be open to the possibility of both opposite sex and same-sex desires, even if they never act upon them. It simply won't be an issue. People will no longer feel the need to label themselves as gay or straight, because in a future post-homophobic society, no one will really care. It won't matter individually, socially, culturally, politically. And therefore, love will transcend sexual orientation. That's the hope I have, the hope that one day the need for different sexual orientations and gender identities will become redundant, and that people like me will no longer have to fight for LGBTI rights. Thank you.